So this is the Megaphase 12 analog multi-tap phaser from AJH Synth. Now this is a mono phase effect with a little cool trick up its sleeve to get left and right outputs, which we will come to. We have a straight input and a second input with a level pot. We've got an inbuilt LFO, and we get the LFO out, which is handy, and the depth is the mix amount, so all the way dry to all the way wet. We set the frequency of this phasing, the emphasis or the resonance, that feedback point, and we can choose how many stages of phasing we have, all the way from 2 to 12. And that's what this left output, the main output, is always going to be. So the kind of 50-50 mix, an emphasis around 12, that tends to be what most analog phaser circuits are, whether they're 8 stages or 4 like a small stone from Electro-Harmonix and so on. The cool bit, and what takes this so much further than other phasers, is this separate emphasis stage. We could have a 7-stage phaser with the emphasis from stage 9, which will sound entirely different to an 8-stage phaser with emphasis from 9. We get phase cancellations and notches and a wider image if we use these left and rights, again, which I'll come to. More bass, more throaty, less throaty, more resonant. There's a whole world to explore in there. And finally, this left and right trick. As I said, the left out is always this main stage output. The right output, rather than being some cheap kind of phasing version against the basic output, is the emphasis stage. So the left out here would be the 7-stage phaser. The feedback around the whole thing is set by this emphasis stage, but we're also getting the 9th stage as a separate output on the right. So it makes for a really cool and quite different way of creating a stereo image. We've got rate control for the LFO. We get a depth control because that's pre-routed to frequency CV in 1. We have a frequency CV in 2 with an attenuverter, and that takes us through the panel. We also have emphasis CV, I should say, and this becomes a handy attenuator for that. So let's get into some patches, because this thing sounds ace. So for this first patch, I've got a mix of 7 oscillators, because I wanted to give this thing lots to kind of chew on, 3 of which are my bass tone, and then a 4-voice chord with root, 3rd, 5th and 7th up top. Now let's check out that dry input sound before coming into the Megaphase 12. And so lots of detune. It's not a perfectly stable chord, and that's what I want. Big, rich analog chord sound from lots of analog oscillators. So let's plug our input into the Megaphase 12. I'm going to turn the depth and emphasis down, and then we'll start to play around with no CV, just the internal LFO to start with. Now I'm using the left and right outputs, and here I'm getting a 10-stage out and the 7 emphasis stage out on the right. As we explained, that right output is as if the emphasis pattern and the emphasis is a second stage on its own. It's not just a kind of cheap phase inversion trick to get fake stereo. Now it's not a true stereo device, it is mono with this additional emphasis stage as a separate output, but it's giving us a nice stereo image here. So let's play around. And let's change the emphasis stage and stage and listen how drastic and quite different the tones are. You can hear that stereo image between the two change as well. Now there's the classic kind of 4-stage phaser. And as you can see and hear there, the different stages and different emphasis stages are giving us quite different tones, both in stereo image, the amount of bottom end, the kind of phase cancellation between them. Let's add some modulation to this as well. I'm going to add some stepped random to FCV2. If I was to plug this into FCV1, it will cut out the internal LFO, but I do still want that, so I'm going to turn that down. Got FCV2 with some stepped random. Bring the LFO back in. I'm going to add a modulated looping envelope. This looping envelope itself is speeding up and slowing down to the emphasis CV, and this emphasis will become an attenuator for the CV in. Let's kill the modulation. Now throughout this, I'll be using input 2, and you can hear like most phasers do get a little bleed through. But I've been using input 2 for its level control. There is some kind of drive on tap with the amount of input level we've got. But I've just been keeping it out of that more clipped range for now. Let's just go for one long, slow sweep before we move on to another patch. And I've been super gushy about this online already. It just sounds amazing. I try not to get too over the top in the video, but sweet Jesus, this thing sounds so good, especially just over a load of rich waveforms. Let's move on to another patch. So for this patch, I just quickly wanted to have a look at using this as a kind of tonal shaper for drums. Now, if I take my emphasis down and my depth all the way down, which is effectively the mix, I've got this snare sound running into it. Simple 808 style snare, and I've got a kick running separate to the mega phase, just pinning down the rhythm. Now let's use the mega phase to add a bit of colour and kind of ring and noise to this snare. Some modulation on FCV2, which I'll pull out for now. can just find these notches. We could then use the LFO. Or some separate stepped random. Changing that noise character up top. Now let's bring the kick back in. So as a sound design tool, just for processing and making things just ring that bit noisier, it's great for kind of sample fodder and creating your own sounds, or as a modulated kind of lead snare drum, if you could have a lead snare drum. You get the idea. You can use this as a shaper as opposed to the kind of standard phaser type patches that you may already be thinking of. So here's another relatively quick patch. I've got some oscillators into the Gemini 2412. Check out the video for this absolute beast of a dual filter if you haven't. I will link it in the description. Going into the phaser, into a VCA, and then this is what we're recording. I'm coming out of the left output only, depths all the way down. We can hear some of the noise this is adding, very typical of other analog phasers I've used. What's cool about the emphasis on this is that even with the depth down, the mix should be dry. Because of the way the emphasis is wired up in the kind of internal feedback, we can still use that even over the dry sound. So let's crank up the emphasis. It's almost like a static basic EQ. And I've got some velocity, another sequence into FCV2. Let's add some LFO as well. And a completely different phaser sound with different stages and emphasis stages chosen. It will do you kind of small stone, krautrock, Jürgen Hebel style phasing, all in one. So in this patch, I'm now going mono in, stereo out. And again, that right output, it's not actually a stereo device, it's mono in and really mono out, but the left out is always the depth between dry and wet. We've got 100% wet out, which I'm going to come to in a second. And the right output is actually tapping its output from this emphasis stage. So it becomes a kind of second output, if you like, that does work well in stereo a lot of the time. Now my wet output here is what we're going to explore, and we're going to create a secondary feedback path. With this as is, the standard kind of emphasis feedback path will just give us this gorgeous analog phasing, as you've heard so far in the video. Now I'm taking this wet output into a spring reverb unit that's 100% wet, that's then coming back into input 2. My input is a modulated wavetable, so let's first make that static. Bring up the level of the spring reverb coming back into input 2. I'm just going to pull the cable out and notice this big, wide, reverberant dimension disappear. All of a sudden seems dry. With it again. So that secondary feedback path works great. Let's get this wavetable modulating again. And like with any feedback path, it's a little bit of a balancing act between input level and emphasis. You potentially clip and overload a little bit, but let's play around. And again, without it, somehow very dry again. So let's move to a different patch, exploiting this potential secondary feedback path before exploring feedback and noise and audio rate modulation and closing out the video. So here's another feedback path, and you're currently listening to the dry sound. Let's get some normal phasing going on. And we'll start without any modulations, non-external, and the depth for this LFO, we'll leave that down. Now my wet output is going off into a digital delay, then another phaser, then clouds from mutable instruments with granular and pitch shifting. And it's then coming back in on input 2. Creates one hell of an effect having this complex feedback path. Let's get some modulation. And again, we'll get quite different phasing sounds by changing the stages and emphasis stages. A lot more low end in that one. So that's just a couple of ways to exploit that feedback path. And just for a bit of fun before we end, let's get into some self-patching, modulation of itself and audio rate modulation to send it kicking and screaming with lots of noise to finish the video. So to finish on, I thought we'd patch this back into itself and create some chaos, noise and feedback for all those noise artists out there. So I'm taking the right output back into input 1. Let's go input 2, then we can control its level. Left output is what we're going to record, and I've patched the wet out back into FCV2. So here we go. It's like an old-fashioned kettle boiling. So there you go. Thanks for checking out this video of the Mega Phase 12. Be sure to check out the Gemini 2412 video that is on my channel. The Finalizer REQ video is coming very soon as well. Very tasty EQ, enhancer, and basic kind of reverb, which is great for adding space and depth and dimension to your sounds. As always, with anything from AJH Synth, this is fantastic. Kind of cream of the crop, top level, whatever they decide to put their hands on. Always really impressive. Thanks for watching. Hit like and subscribe. Leave some comments. I'll be sure to reply. Go support me on Patreon if you'd like any extra content. And cheers for watching.